All right, Ben. Thanks so much for joining. Excited to talk about a number of different issues today. Would love to start if you could just talk a little bit about your work. I know that you do a bunch of interesting work in Niskanen and some work in volunteer capacity too with More Perfect Union. Would love to just hear a little bit about how you talk about the work that you do in the pro-democracy field.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Great to talk to you. For at the Niskanen Center, I am the director for state capacity. And how we are defining state capacity is the ability of government to actually implement its policy. So we're a relatively new initiative. We're about a year old. Niskanen is mostly focused on domestic policies, a think tank here in DC. Their existing policy teams before we started include climate, immigration, criminal justice, and social policy. So the way that we view our state capacity efforts is that we're both a vertical and a horizontal. So we are vertical because there are a range of issues that fall very squarely within state capacity. Like these are the challenges that we're facing and what do we need to do about that? But also then as a horizontal because we cut across all these other different specific policy areas. So what does it look like when we have state capacity challenges when it comes to criminal justice or when it comes to immigration or when it comes to transmission lines that need to be built around the country? So we've got four primary pillars that we focus on because almost anything can mean state capacity, but we've had to prioritize. So the four things that we talk about, if you want a government that can actually implement its policies, you have to be able to hire the right people and fire the wrong ones. So this is largely centered around civil service reform. Number two, you have to reduce procedural bloat. So this is talking about the range of issues of how have we shackled the government to try to prevent harm from being done. So this is proceduralism, and so this is a lot that's being written by many creative people, but especially within this growing abundance world, which maybe we'll talk about, Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson, and others, but many more others. And then number three, we talk about investing in data and digital infrastructure. And then number four, we talk about closing the feedback loops between policy and implementation. And for us, that mostly means the relationship between Congress and executive agencies. So what does it look like to write law, statute that can be actually implemented effectively? But then what does it look like to kind of build trust and mechanisms so that you get real feedback from the agencies back to Congress to update policy as needed? And so that's related to oversight and other mechanisms. So those are the four big things we work on within state capacity in Niskanen. And then in some related ways, I'm a volunteer leader for More Perfect Union, www.mpu.us. There's a couple more perfect unions out there. And so MPU is a bridging organization. So it's how do we help try to create conditions for people to come together from different backgrounds, different perspectives to meaningfully engage. And that could mean just kind of a social gathering. That could mean a service project working together. But oftentimes the events that I try to set up and lead are conversations around civics. And so how do you start to how do you create the conditions for people to come together to have a kind of a deeper level conversation on issues of local civic renewal, the role of government, what's happening in the government and the world right now. And so that's kind of a complementary effort. So if you think about state capacity and bridging, the way I've been seeing bridging is it's important just by itself, but also I see it as a very important component to building more understanding and trust in our government institutions. And then also trying to debate what do we need to improve, which then goes back to state capacity.
So thanks for that and appreciate learning more about the state capacity work in Niskanen and More Perfect Union. Maybe going to where you just talked about at the end, I'm curious if you can talk about how do you see the work at Niskanen where you're focused essentially on how to make government work better and the work at More Perfect Union about bridging conversations around civics? Do you see them as separate, like separate parts of brains focusing on different things, or how do you see them as related in almost your personal theory of change of what this country needs right now?
I see them connected with let's say like a dotted line. I think they're kind of related overall. What I hope is going to be helpful contributions to our society. But on a day-to-day basis, I'm not sitting in one or the other and seeing, like, hey, this is exactly tied and this is directly supporting over there. I think it's a little bit broader, more loose connection.
Cool. Okay, so let's dive into that a little bit more. I'm curious. So I think that there's been, well, let me start here. It seems like that there has been more interest in this notion of state capacity, this notion of, as you call it, the ability of government to fulfill its capacity. Do you think that that's true that there has been more interest, and why do you think that's the case?
Definitely feels like there's been more interest. And I think some of that you can really kind of credit some of the leading writers and thinkers, people that have been communicating some of these things. So Jennifer Palka, she's a senior fellow here at the Niskanen Center. She wrote Recoding America, and that really captured a lot of people's attention. So this was, it's kind of written around civic tech, so how has the government, just based on her experiences, how's the government been trying to update the way that it procures and develops software? And all this very crazy challenges that are very frustrating for people to try to deal with when it comes to this is holding us back from delivering good government experience and good government delivery of services to people in the United States. And so that captured a lot of imagination. But then you've had a series of other books or other people that have been writing about this, including Mark Dunkelman's Why Nothing Works. So kind of a self, like he understands, or the way that he describes it is that it's a critique of the left by the left, by himself, of looking at some of these examples of why government doesn't actually deliver. And then you've got related to all of these is the growing abundance movement. So you've got of most note right now, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book Abundance, which has kicked off a whole kind of series of debates, not just one debate, but a lot of grappling with why aren't we getting the government delivery that we want or that we think we should have. So I think you get a lot of these policy elites, these, like thought leaders that are putting out a lot of ideas, but it's also capturing the politicians' attention because you're getting feedback from real Americans saying, hey, our experience with government sucks, or we're not getting what we think we deserve. And so I think it's people that are coming up with ideas and framing, right? Framing. I think the politics are starting to apply in a way that maybe it hadn't before. And you're also just getting a lot of frustration from everyday Americans that are saying, hey, we want better. And, what does that start to look like?
So that makes a lot of sense. And I think, I mean, it seems like there's been a lot of research studies out there that sort of go into the fact that Americans distrust institutions, they're dissatisfied with the form of government they're receiving. So part of what I'm trying to do with this series is understand sort of where the pro-democracy community or movement needs to go. I'm curious, so I mean, pro-democracy community can be loosely defined as organizations working on, ensuring that our institutions are respected, rule of law is followed. I'm curious if you think that there is intersection between a movement to get government to work better and a pro-democracy movement that at this specific time is fearful of what's happening to institutions, is fearful of rule of law not being followed, potentially as Americans not believing in the concept of democracy. I guess what is the intersection, do you think, between democracy working better and government working better?
I think they're both intention, but also mutually supportive at the same time. So, a lot of people talk about we need to build trust in government, but if government's not delivering for any given American, why should they trust the government? And so you have to have a more effective government that delivers. But at the same time, when you start to assess, some of the tensions, uh, you start to get into the same story that's playing out in the state capacity world, the abundance world, and the pro-democracy world. There's a tension between speed, outcomes, and expertise versus participation, deliberation, and accountability. Those are like just a lot of terms that can end up on the other on opposite sides. And so to break that down a little bit, government needs to be responsive and actually deliver on things within a specific set of like a reasonable period of time. But in order to do that, maybe you don't get full deliberation with the public. Or if you want to rely on expertise, so like, really smart people have trained all their lives in some very specific subject. If you balance that with the need to hear the opinions and views, rightful views of everyday Americans that might be impacted by a decision, those can be in tension. Or if you talk about delivering outcomes, like what matters is that the government delivers on, building a bridge or, rolling out broadband. Um, but then you also want to be able to hold government accountable for things that they do poorly. And so this is largely gets wrapped up I guess the most public view of this right now is within the abundance discussion and debate of, what's gone wrong. And, government went through kind of like, you have to kind of look through some of the history over the last 100 years where we used to build a whole lot of things, but at the same time, it was very disruptive to some people's lives. And really, like when government just decides and builds something, there's going to be winners and losers. Uh, and then also there was environmental harms. And so a whole host of laws came through and then regulations and bureaucracy to say we need to prevent government from doing really bad things. We've gone too far. The pendulum has swung too far towards, just getting stuff done or taking action and not being accountable. But now a lot of people are calling saying that, well, now we've got too many protections against government action, and therefore we can't get anything done. And so, in order to build a new bridge or do any kind of infrastructure, all the hoops you have to go through can be challenged by anybody. So everybody has a veto, and then it becomes economically not sustainable to actually do anything, and nothing gets done. And so if you can let these things stay at like very polar opposites of speed, outcomes, expertise, participation, deliberation, and accountability, but you can have both. You just have to find a way. Like it's not necessarily an either or. I think my whole job is to try to figure out what's the right balance and how are we going to do that better.
Cool. So you talked earlier about like this balance between speed outcomes and expertise and participation and deliberation. Again, not either or, but there's sort of a spectrum of things. I do wonder sometimes, I mean, the balance between seeing some of these goals as almost like quasi technocratic versus democratic. So this is, I mean, I guess relying on experts. I'm curious if you can talk about how you think some of the goals of state capacity can actually be strengthened by more participation and deliberation. And so I guess to get a little bit more refined on that, I think sometimes I hear policymakers and policy discussions where it's essentially, well, we need to get people to buy into a specific policy, as opposed to people giving their opinions will make this policy better. Right. And so I like when I hear you talking about participation and deliberation, that's my interpretation that it actually strengthens what comes out on the other side. But I'm curious, I mean, I'm curious your reflections to that, but if you can think of ways in which, like, as state capacity is promoted, that there's this sense of, well, if we actually get people to provide feedback, participate in the process, the end outcome will be better rather than we just need people to buy into the agenda.
A lot of this has not been figured out. And
Yep.
I think it's up to all of us, like, people like us that are trying to, think about these issues and have the opportunity to really dig in on a lot of these issues and engage with the people that have to make decisions every day with, across a thousand different emergencies that are happening around the country. Uh, what does it look like to still maintain those mechanisms for input and actual participation and deliberation without speeding things, without slowing things down, and without giving everybody a veto? And I think a lot of that's going to come through technology, which we haven't fully integrated the full potential of how do we use all of this incredible, software, these technology tools, not just AI, but just we can come up with new mechanisms for trying to do that. And just one example would be we've got some what feels like fairly outdated ways to get public input. So if you look like the Federal Register, you put something out there for comments, and there's a lot of criticism about, well, who ends up submitting a comment? And is it helpful? And is that actually representative of the people that might be impacted? And we could do that, but we could also do other things. So a lot of what Jen Paulka has written about is like this product model approach, but also user-centered design, user-centered research. And OMB has done a lot of work on this, including through the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs, OIRA. But there's a lot of improvements that could be done. So anytime the government's going to put something out, or people are thinking about taking some kind of action from government, whether you're talking about Congress or you're talking about an executive agency, we could be a little bit more proactive on identifying who's most likely to be impacted and how do we get meaningful input from them without a veto. And I think if we can set those kind of mechanisms up, it's going to be a little bit, I think people would be more willing to use them, if that kind of makes sense on both sides. And so we just haven't cracked that code. That's one of this tension between actually getting things done at speed, because speed is cost. So if you slow things down, everything's going to cost more. And we know that we don't have more and more money to spend on these things. But you also want to do it in a good pro-democracy way. But it's up to us to come up with the new mechanisms and tools to actually enable that. Because otherwise, until we do, they're going to stay on the polar opposites, and you're going to end up with one or the other, and then that's not exactly what we're trying to optimize for.
So it's not truly representative, and you're just hearing from loudest voices rather than what people actually want to.
You could have loudest voices. You could talk about what's captured. You could talk about the threat of
Yep.
AI comments. I mean, there's a lot of things that just opening it up to a somewhat bizarre, not bizarre, but kind of a hidden federal register that most Americans have no idea exists and could care less, but might have
Yeah.
a real impact on their lives. If you're not going out to meet them where they are, then, government's not doing as good as it could do.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that. Let's talk for a minute more about MPU. I'd love to hear a little bit more about like why did you get involved in MPU? Like why does the bridging work speak to you?
I think most people will get involved with things outside of their daily work, whatever it is that their job is, kind of out of circumstance and just whatever kind of happens to be like a very personal decision-making process at that moment. So for me, one of my very good friends ended up leading it. So Garrett Cathcart is the executive director, so he's leading MPU across the country. And I had already known him for years, and he said, "Hey, I'd like you to come do this thing." And so part of it was like, "Hey, yeah, that'd be a nice thing to be able to participate in." At the same time, I started about 3 years ago, and had been looking around for a while, looking around the country, like this isn't exactly going as I hoped, just in terms of polarization. Uh, but also, there's been a lot of really smart writing on how society started to change, where we all live in our own silos and our own bubbles, physical and digital. You can go across your life and on any given day and only read the things that align with your worldview because they are presented to you now through algorithms. Or connecting with very specific kind of micro communities that in some ways is amazing if you can connect to them because you're finding people that like what you like and want to talk about what you want to talk about. But at the same time, that's very limiting. And so we're not kind of connected to all these people from different perspectives. And so looking around, I was like, well, what could I do about that? And a lot of people talk about, oh, you should run for office and go make change. That's not necessarily for everyone. I applaud anybody that wants to run for office. But this is another way that I could try to engage in that. And then to add in two more pieces, why it just kind of made sense and why I think I've stuck with it. I was in the army, but both my father and my grandfather were in the army, and they would tell stories, and then I got to experience it too. But they would tell stories before I joined of how the army brought people together from vastly different parts of life for a shared mission and formed lifelong bonds that otherwise never would have been formed. That's just the nature of how the military can bring people together. And then I got to see that myself. And I thought, wow, more people should have the opportunity to do those kind of things, to feel that, and to be able to engage meaningfully with people that are just totally unlike them on any given day. And we just don't have that many places to be able to do that. So then there was the army aspect. And then also, uh, I've got a little bit of background in facilitating conversations. So human-centered design, how do you intentionally bring a group of people together and not just sit around the table and have the loudest voices dominate a room? And what does it look like to draw insights from everybody to make it a little bit more equal? And then what do you do with that information after that? And so building off of that, that was another way that I personally try to structure all my events, my MPU events, with those principles in mind of uh, how do I bring this, how do you think of everything from the beginning to the end of when they enter to how do they feel greeted to like how do you set the tone for the interaction between people and then what's the follow up, all of those things I think are really important for people to have a good experience. And so I guess all of those things come together of why I started and why I think it's still important. So part of it is the subject matter I think is really important. I think we should be doing more bridging, but also part of it's very personal just because I like doing those kind of things.
Do you feel like, well, let me just one question that I've always had with the bridging space is how do you make sure that you're appealing and working with not just people that want to participate in bridging work, so not just with people that want to be deployers and maybe like you're having people come to events, so essentially explicitly you are doing that. So I don't know how much, but I just would be curious to get your thoughts of like what it almost goes to. I think the army example is a powerful one because it's people from diverse perspectives that are there. I mean, partially because of choice, but they're not there essentially to they're not there explicitly to engage a cross difference, but that's what happens, right? Whereas I feel like sometimes in the bridging space, people are coming to engage a cross difference rather than something else that then leads them to do so. So I'm just curious if you have thoughts on how potentially to appeal to people that aren't necessarily sort of on like, team
Team
bridging to
brilliance.
start.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's a great question. I think we're always, I don't know if struggling is the right word, but it's always a challenge. Uh, these conversations that, around civics and whatever's happening politically in the moment are very much targeted to people that want to come and have a space for those conversations for sure. I think where MPU and others have a huge opportunity to try to do bridging without necessarily like doing bridging explicitly is through service projects. And so I think, finding organizations you can partner with. So the people that are either that are kind of working alongside yourself. So if you can partner with other organizations that have different missions, uh, but then always talk about this. Let's say we did a Habitat for Humanity build and you spend all day, hammering nails next to someone. You've made a connection, but I would love to see that taken one step further. Like, how do you build off of that experience to then have a conversation? Like an explicit, articulate, like very specific conversation on like, hey, let's talk about something like so essentially having a bridging conversation. How do you balance that and like will you be up for that? That's really how you set the tone and how you create the experience. But I think service offers a way to bring different sets of people together. That is even without explicitly doing bridging, you're doing bridging if you do that right.
hmm Yeah, that makes sense, and it feels like there's an opportunity to be thinking about that, to be thinking about that more in the current context. I'm trying to figure out just a few more questions, but like ways, and you articulated a little bit about the beginning, but so we talked about your state capacity work, we've talked about your bridging work, and I mean this might be like totally astray in left field, but when you brought about um, service. I'm just curious, like, is there a way to actually think about, and there might not be, I'm just like throwing it out, but like service in relations to making government work better or people getting to know government as well. And so I'm sort of, I mean, it's not necessarily making the linkage between state capacity and service, but it's just making the sense of like, is that a way for people to actually get closer to government? Is there a way that that could be intertwined in some way, shape, or form too?
I think a lot about the intersection of bridging more broadly and this conversation around government,
Sure,
trying to
sure.
rebuild trust. And so
Yeah, yeah,
conversations,
yeah,
for example, could absolutely do that. On service, I mean, there's AmeriCorps,
yeah,
there are like actual government service programs, even though ideally that's going to come back someday and
yeah, yeah.
it's going through the courts right now. But that's an example of like a government delivery of service opportunities, right? And how do we do that? And I think that's one way to kind of bring that out. Uh, yeah, I don't know. I think about that often of what does it look like to bridge these worlds. So there's pro-democracy, there's state capacity, and then slash abundance because they're pretty related. And where does it make sense to have some overlaps? Because I think they're all kind of aiming roughly towards the same things. And I think there's opportunities out there, but I'm still trying to explore some of those.
Well, so I mean, I'm curious to get a little some of your initial thoughts of like how they do bridge together or how you, it's not like when you said that they're related to each other, would be curious, like what have some of your initial instincts been about like, MPU Ben and Niskanen Ben, like how do they intersect?
Well, we talked about this a little bit earlier that if like part of what the pro-democracy movement wants to achieve is to build trust and understanding and engagement in the government. That's less likely to happen if you have a government that can actually deliver. And people experience that like their experience with governments is always bad. So everybody likes to, criticize the DMV, right? So like, hey, that's a terrible experience, or like I have to go renew something, or like this taxes are bad. Like if you only dealing with these like frustrating situations with the government, why should you give more trust to the political process and all the other things that come with that? And so I think there are two efforts that are kind of going towards the same thing that you have to make a government that actually does more and does better. And then at the same time, you need to be able to tell that story effectively and then bring people along so that they understand. And then you offer them ways to engage, which is then going to build trust. And so I think if you're anybody can just focus on one, that is a good use of time. But I think just like if we're looking at a society level, if we're not improving both at the same time and you're only focusing on one, you're not going to get the outcome that you want. You can't just say trust in government and just say that over and over and over again and bring people together. That doesn't happen by itself. Like you have to deliver so that you're like you have to do something in order for them to build trust with it.
So I think I really appreciate that point. It does seem like there is this like so even if you're in the pro-democracy movement and like you're focused on sort of, restoring, rebuilding, reviving democracy, but you're not worried about government working better. It's the whole like what are you getting people to trust? So to that point. Um I guess one way of thinking about it could be um so like I'm in the pro-democracy space and I'm focused on, trust in elections, trust in institutions, getting people to get along better. And I know that that state capacity work or the government working better work is happening, and that's great. Like I know that that's there. And I sometimes think that that's a little bit of how sort of the fields operate. It's, in silos and maybe I mean, that's sort of how the funding world works. That's sort of how things operate. And so there might be nothing wrong with that, but I'm curious if you, to the point that you're making on like they both have to be happening at the same time. Do you think that there's a way for the actual, and I don't, again, I don't know the answer to this, but do you think there's a way for those work streams to intersect more, as opposed to them operating in parallel?
Yes. There are certainly some things that can and probably should just stay separate, and it doesn't really matter that they're connected. But especially around public participation or like civic engagement, there's that naturally bridges both of those worlds of capacity of like how are we doing actual better government delivery of services, which requires input from the people that you're going to deliver to. That's the whole point. Versus the kind of civic engagement, pro-democracy, participation, deliberation space of like how do you get people more engaged and then trust in the process as they participate in it. And I think that's an area that needs to be completely transformed. And I think technology will go a long way. Technology is not the answer to everything, but I think technology can and should be playing a really significant role in how do we reimagine this sense of public input and deliberation into like political processes. Like, what does that actually look like without slowing things down? In fact, like ideally, it would both speed things up and make it more effective because it would have more genuine input. And I think that's possible. I think we can have both. We just have to get creative and really try to do some new things.
That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I mean the partisan politicization of everything is certainly a challenge. And so I mean the correlate to this, and I think this has been a lot of the crux of the conversation, but what are you most hopeful for? What are you excited about given everything that you're working on right now?
I'm just really excited about the opportunity for significant, what I hope is going to be positive change. And so for a lot of the, like, let's take comprehensive civil service reform, Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. That's a long time ago. And there's been lots of tweaks, but when you talk about a big reimagination of like, what do we need to do at this point in time to update some of these long lasting, like these laws have been on the books for a while. The Paperwork Reduction Act, we've written a lot about that. That was first passed in 1980 and then updated in 1995. That's still a long time ago when we're talking about, there's a lot of like core technology pieces to that legislation. And the technology we wrote in 1995 is pretty different than 2025. And so there just feels like there's going to be an opportunity, if not this Congress, potentially after midterms, if not after midterms, potentially after the next presidential election, for if we can put out good packages of material, like we could have a big influence on going big again. Like if we're going to go for civic renewal, let's go ambitious. And I think there's more and more appetite for that in a way for some of these wonky issues that would never get prioritized, which is how we constantly end up, in the place that we are. Hey, that's great. We've got these very, high level policy priorities. We've got a limited time to get them done. We're going to focus on this, and then all the guts of the government kind of just gets kicked down, the can gets kicked down the road. And I think we've got a political opportunity in the future, hopefully near future, um, where that's going to be different.
So the vastness of the challenges require, similarly ambitious solutions in ways that might not have been apparent before.
Well, I think we're coming up on like we're actively trying to find those solutions, but what's long been missing is the political will and leadership to
Yep.
drive those forward because it's never been a priority. Where I think the conversation around making government work better, so not over what government should or should not do. So that's kind of like policy, like we should go, take action over here, but just on the fact of if we want to go take action over there, can we do that? That's really come to the forefront in a way that I don't think's been present for a long time.